This is Emery from California wants to talk about how we can explain being gender non-binary scientifically. Emery,
Yeah,
how are you doing today?
yeah.
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm awesome. So really quickly, is there anything particular is that a pretty good summary? You just like what I've got here is just how do we explain gender non-binary scientifically? Is there anything specific that you wanted to touch on before we like dig into that really quickly?
Yeah, so I'm non-binary. That's how I identify,
Mhm.
and I've seen like a bunch of your videos. I've watched your stuff. I've saw the sex and sensibility video and stuff, and I've seen a lot
Great
of
that
different
video.
ways that people explain like transness through science and stuff. And I love science. And
Mhm.
so, first, I'm just kind of curious because oftentimes when we have these conversations, it's about binary transitions. And so I was
Mhm.
just firstly wondering what type of science and stuff we have behind that. And then also, kind of what should we do with that knowledge? Because a lot of trans people feel scared when we start talking too scientifically about what transness is, because then we would have to like prove ourselves. We would have to like show this, oh, well, we are actually trans or whatever. And like, or people could take that knowledge and then try to like convert us and things like that. So I guess it's kind of a two-part question about what science do we have to kind of explain gender non-binary, and then what is a good way to kind of deal with that knowledge.
Right, right. So really quick, I would just point out, like, if this would be the train of speaking that I would use. Number one is that sex and gender are different things, right? They're completely different realms of thinking and realms of science. Gender is a social construct; it is not a biological construct. You cannot reduce gender down, nor can you assume or predict gender from biological sex. And this is something a lot of people get touchy about. And you can point to, pick your favorite science book. Just about this is one that I read on this show before. This is Genetics: A Conceptual Approach by Benjamin Pierce. This is actually the textbook that I used in my undergrad to study genetics. This was, assigned to me by my university, and it says right here in chapter 4.1, sex is determined by a number of different mechanisms. So it's there's not just one on-off switch for sex. There's a million different ways that sex is determined, not a single one of which only has two options. And then here it says in this last paragraph, gender is not the same as sex. Biological sex refers to the anatomical and physical phenotype physiological phenotype of an individual. Gender is a category assigned by the individual or others based on behavior and cultural practices. One's gender need not coincide with one's biological sex. So that's biology right there. You can also point to anthropology, which is a field of biology because humans are animals. I study bioanthropology. That's
Hmm.
that's what what I do. And here in this anthropology textbook from Oxford University Press by Robert Lavenda and Emily Schultz, you've got a whole thing on here about how many anthropologists did some significant research throughout the 20th century that demonstrated that culturally shaped gender roles considered appropriate for males and females in a given society could not be reduced to or predicted by the biological sex of an individual. I didn't know that's where I got that phrasing. Apparently, I just remembered that from this book, which is whether determined by anatomy, physiology, chromosomes, or anything else. Today, anthropologists, along with others, call into question the assumption that human beings come in two and only two biological sexes and that gender roles are built from those sexes. And it goes on and on to talk about the difference between sex and gender there. And so, like, this isn't like I'm not going to sit here and say this isn't controversial. Of course it is. It's a politically salient topic, but it's not like scientifically controversial, or at least not as much as a lot of people like to pretend. It's this is just how things are. And so when you talk then about being non-binary or being, a different gender besides what we would call boy or girl, I would then point to the fact that there are countless cultures across history and across the globe that have more than two genders. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now on the YouTubes. You can go to, if you just Google, if you're watching this later on, you can look up PBS map of gender of societies with more than two gender. Sorry, map of gender diverse cultures is what this page is called, from PBS.org, and it's an interactive map that shows like a couple dozen different cultures from around the world that have more than two genders, that have a third or maybe even a fourth gender. um, and sometimes that includes being trans, and sometimes it kind of doesn't, and sometimes being non-binary is something that actually we see being recognized throughout the world. And so like when you're presented with that knowledge, and when you're presented with like the archaeological theory of like understanding this kind of this ontology of gender, you either need to decide that either one predominant cultural idea of gender has steamrolled over the planet and wiped out through genocide and forced conversion all of these other gender ideologies as much as they possibly can, which is something that we have a tremendous amount of historical evidence for. Or the alternative hypothesis is all of these other cultures were just blue-haired liberals and they don't know anything about science. And that just doesn't really seem reasonable to me. So that would be the way that I would present that to somebody. If somebody wanted to talk about gender, non-binary gender from a scientific perspective, I would first give them the scientific facts that sex and gender are different things, and that that it's
Yeah.
currently something that we're isn't something that can be built upon just a simple on-off switch in any department. And that gender is something that changes from person to person, from culture to culture, from day to day. Sometimes it means different things.
Yeah.
And here's a bunch of other cultures out there. And then I would dig into, because it's my field, I would dig into the archaeology of like gender and whatnot. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah.
is there more that you wanted to get into?
Um, yes. But I think where my question kind of comes from is I've heard when you're explaining this to other people who don't really have that understanding, I've heard you bring up how people's brains look differently, and oftentimes like trans people will have like quote unquote the brain of a woman in a quote unquote man's body,
Right.
and like that's the type of rhetoric that's a little bit scary for some people because one, that excludes non-binary people, and two, it's like people can use that then to like, oh well, let's fix the brain, transness isn't natural, or whatever the dumb argument they come up with is,
Right. So like there's way I am not a neuroscientist. I've spoken on this briefly in like the ways that I'm able to from my experience. I always recommend this book
Mm,
called Evolution's Rainbow by Dr. Joan Ruff-Garden, who goes into some detail about that. But also, if you wanted to, this is another thing. I'll put this in the chat again so that people can see it easily. And if you want to look it up, you can as well. You can go to YouTube and just look up. There's a guy named Robert Sapolsky. He's a neuroendocrinologist, neurobiologist out of Stanford University, as is Joan Ruff-Garden. And he's got a few videos. I'm putting one right here on brain gender and kind of the pathway from chromosomes to gonads to endocrine systems to genitals to secondary sexual characteristics, and how every single bit of that can go haywire. And then here's like a 10-year-old lecture as well about how neural architecture tends to differ and be more representative of what you might expect from a person's gender identity rather than what their genitalia tells you. However, it is really important. The reason why I'm careful talking about that is because it's really important to remember that there is no such thing as a boy brain and a girl brain. It's just like kind of some minor differences
yeah.
that we see, that we can kind of point to. And again, can't stress this enough. Not saying it isn't controversial, just saying that there's a lot of good data out there. And what we're seeing right now, as far as I can tell, is that there's less of a clash of science versus science and more of a clash of like our scientific understanding of these things clashing with our cultural understanding of these things. And unfortunately, there are a lot of
Yeah.
really great scientists who are caught up in the cultural understanding of things. And that's a bold thing for me to say, but it's the honest truth of what I've been seeing. It's just like, we have kind of some outdated ideology getting in the way of modern ideas, if that makes any sense. If I go any
Yeah,
further with that kind of
for
line of
sure.
thinking, though, however, you could power a small city, but by the power of my smugness, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, that's pretty much everything that I would have for this little section. I just wanted to, you've been waiting for so long, and that was a great question. I wanted to get it in there, but like, does that answer everything for you today, Emery?
Um, yeah, I guess my second part of the question was like kind of how, uh, like what we do sort of with that. But I think you may have kind of answered that with like, um, basically starting with the science and then kind of being like, gender doesn't have anything to do with that and stuff like that. But
That's the
yeah,
way
just
I would
it's
explain
just
it. But
that
like as far as what we do with it culturally, I would say we get out of our own way and get out of our ethnocentric little box and start,
right.
stop trapped by the narrow
Yeah, no,
heuristics that
for sure.
we are taught as kids. It's the same reason
Yeah,
why,
no, I mean, I'm with you
when
there, but
somebody goes to,
yeah.
well, and somebody goes to middle school and they learn, oh, there's 3 states of matter. No, there fucking aren't. And it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a
Yeah.
fourth one, and you can have more than one at the same time. You can have a triple point where it's all 3 of them at the same, like it's a lot more interesting. And you've got this group of people here saying, no, damn it, it's 3 state, it's only solid, liquid, or gas. And that's exactly what we're seeing here is it's a lot more interesting
Yeah.
than what you learned in middle school. And we've got a
Yeah,
bunch of people saying, no, damn it, I learned
yeah,
it in
No,
middle school. It's like, no,
I
there's more than that.
and the
I
reason why
studied
it's
science
different, the
research
reason
too,
why
so
there is well, real quick, Emery, I think the reason why we
yeah.
look at the 3 states of matter differently, politically speaking, than the reason why we look at the binary structure of gender politically, is because, and I think you will look out the window and you will see that we live, at least I do, I know you do as well, in the United States, a country that is dominated by well, frankly, a form of Christianity, one form of Christianity or another that that pretty much controls the narrative that
Mhm.
is overrepresented in legislatures across the country and therefore is calling the shots and in a lot of ways, although there are many people who are not religious or are not affiliated, we don't see a proportionate number of people in legislatures or an executive or even the judiciary that would reflect that. And so we have those people in large part pulling the strings of culture to push that narrative, to keep it going. And
Yeah.
even if a person is not overtly religious, they, unlike I think it was Mark, who is immune or not immune. He said he's not immune, but he's not influenced by cultural forces. We still live. We are immersed in the cultural reality that has been set from the past, and the culture is changing slowly over time. But it's still rooted in, I would say, a Judeo-Christian past, an understanding that has sort of taken hold. And so yeah, that's how you run into atheists who are be like, "There's only 2 genders," and they might have set aside the fairy tales of their youth, they might think of it as, and they
Yeah.
maintain a blind spot to the fairy tales of their biology teachers, whereas they might not do the
Yeah.
same thing with the states of matter. So we have blind spots. Theists, atheists are no different in that respect. But yeah, I
Yeah, well,
hope we
thank you.
answered
Yeah,
your
I think
question.
that yeah, and I think, these conversations are important to have. And I appreciate you taking my call and talking to me a bit about that.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for calling. Emery, I hope you have an awesome rest of your day, and feel free to call back if you have any other questions for us. All right.